Well, it's great to welcome you back as we continue our studies of the Greek of the New Testament. You're making good progress. We're coming this time to chapter 8, and again, I'm going to keep nagging you that if you're pressing ahead without doing the exercises, then you're going to be feeling the pain a little bit as we go along. The exercises are the key to mastering this material, and so I hope that you're being a good disciplined student and obeying my instructions along that line. But this lesson brings us to one of the more important aspects of New Testament Greek, and certainly I think this chapter especially is going to warrant your attention, your careful focus, and so on, because we're coming at this point to actually two separate matters that are quite important. One of them is simply the use of personal pronouns, and of course you know personal pronouns are just entirely ubiquitous throughout the use of virtually any language. Personal pronouns are terms that use a place instead of a noun. So I could say I throw the ball to Joe, or I throw the ball to him. And the word him there, of course, is the pronoun that stands in the place of its so-called antecedent, which is the word Joe. And certainly virtually every language that I'm aware of at least uses pronouns because it prevents us from being repetitive in the language. I wouldn't want to say I throw the ball to Joe and then I go talk to Joe and then I leave Joe. I want to be able to use a pronoun to kind of make the sentence a little bit more readable or hearable, as the case may be. And certainly in the Greek New Testament we have something very much like that. In fact, I think it's safe to say that you could, if you have a Greek New Testament, you could just flip it open randomly to any page, and you would find spread throughout that page all kinds of personal pronouns. The words that we are going to learn in this lesson are just constantly showing up in the New Testament. So this is, for that reason alone, a very important text for you to be paying attention to. We're also going to be introducing at this point, however, another important idea, which is the verb of being. The verb of being. In English, the most common expression of that is the word is. So he is in the house is a way of stating the situation of his being. He is being in the house, as it were, and we use the word is. If we conjugate that, of course, we have various ways it's expressed. If I say I is, that's not good grammar. It would be I am in the house. You are, using what can function as both a singular and plural there for the word you. He is, or it is. And so those are the ways we express that in the English language. In Greek also we have one verb that functions in that way. And this, by the way, is part of the reason that Greek was such an important language to use, or such a appropriate language to use for the New Testament, was because it does have a well-defined use of the word is, which is not true of every ancient language. And so that in itself gave Greek a more philosophical kind of aspect and the capacity to explain and communicate some of the truths that are found in the New Testament. So those are the two main things. The other thing we're going to run into in this chapter is a class of words that are called enclitics. Enclitics can be a little confusing, and I want to try to make it as clear as possible as we go along. You know the word proclitic. If you've paid attention in prior lessons, you know that a proclitic is a word that does not have its own accent. When I say ho anthropos, then of course the word ho there, the word for the, doesn't have an accent. It's called a proclitic. It's called a proclitic because it tends to go with the word that immediately follows it in the sentence, so it comes before, or proclitic. Enclitics are just the opposite. These are words that come immediately after a preceding word and are associated with that preceding word. Proclitics don't give rise to any special rules of accent, but enclitics do. And so as we go along, we're going to have to pay attention to a few new rules of accent. I know you were hoping not to have to deal with that, but trust me, this is worth learning, and it's not that tough. So just pay attention as we go along, read the text, listen to my explanations, and hopefully that will be helpful to you, and you'll be able to follow along the explanation on that basis. Personal pronouns in the New Testament are used commonly. The one thing you need to be aware of that Machen does emphasize, and I'll just mention it right now, of the personal pronoun. The word he, for example, he closes the door, or she drives the car. That nominative use of the personal pronoun is fairly infrequent in the New Testament because, as you know, the verb itself tells us who's doing the action. So if I say lege, he says, then the word he is implied in the word lege, he says. So if I were to add the personal pronoun autos lege, he says, then that suggests that there's special emphasis that's going to be attached to that personal pronoun. And that would be true throughout our use of personal pronouns. The nominative tends to be used only when you're in a situation of emphasis, where you're wanting to set a significant contrast or otherwise make it clear that there's some sort of emphatic character that's going to be applied to that particular word. Well, I think that's enough to get us going at this point. What I'd like to do is talk through some of the things that we find in this chapter, and we'll note them as we go along, and then of course we'll spend a little bit of time looking at some exercises, and hopefully by the time we're done you'll be able to plow in and do the rest of the exercises and work your way through in that way. All right, first of all, I've put on the screen here the vocabulary list. It's deceptively short, isn't it? You probably looked at that and thought, well, hot dog, we finally have an easier chapter. And in some ways it is, because of the limited vocabulary that's introduced, but of course there's some other information that's going to be brought to your attention in this chapter which make up for the fact that the vocabulary list is short. You'll notice most of the words that we have here represent personal pronouns. So for example, ego is the word for I. We of course get in English the word ego, made famous by Sigmund Freud, referring to that center of self-consciousness that we all have within us. Not that this should be taken as an endorsement of Freud's psychology, by the way, but we do have that word, ego, and it comes straight from the Greek word ego. So that's pretty easy, and of course we'll be looking at the various ways in which that word is applied in Greek in just a moment. The second person, you, is the word su. And so again, we'll be looking at how that word is declined in a moment, but that simply means you. This is the singular, and I'll just mention to you that in Greek, as you know, there is a sharp distinction between the singular and the plural of the word you. We've already talked about that when we talked about the use of verbs, but it's important to keep that in mind here. So we're going to have both the singular and the plural. There's no distinction between masculine and feminine with respect either to ego or su, because I think for obvious reasons you can see that. But when we come to the third of these, he, she, or it, we do have a distinction in the gender. Autos would be the nominative, singular, masculine. Aute, we'll look at in a moment, is the feminine. Auta is the neuter. This one, therefore, is going to have more forms that we find in the New Testament. And autos is also used in a variety of other ways that we'll be discovering in the next chapter. So for now, all we need to know is that autos is basically the word for he or him. So I, you, and he, those are the three classes of personal pronouns. The other two words we have are the word de. De is a word that means and or but. That may seem a little strange because it doesn't seem that and but have the same meaning, but this is what you would call kind of a soft conjunction. The word kai is a true conjunction where you attach one idea to another idea. Bat and ball, you know that idea. When we use the word de, we're talking in a sense of a kind of soft contrast between two ideas. I hit the ball, but Jane went to the store. Well, you could have said I hit the ball and Jane went to the store. I can also say I hit the ball, but Jane went to the store. There's no lively contrast between the two ideas, but there is a kind of subtle contrast, and that's the common way that we find the word de. And so it's very common in the New Testament. You'll see it extremely frequently. It is postpositive. And as you already know, postpositive means that the word de never shows up first in a Greek sentence. It will usually be the second word in the phrase, and so just keep your eye on that. Otherwise, it's pretty straightforward. The third of the last of the words we're looking at is the word eimi. This is the word that means I am. This is the verb of being that I was mentioning to you earlier, and so it's worth learning this pretty well, and we'll be going through the conjugation of that. And of course, in the exercises, we're going to be seeing the use of the word eimi as well. I was mentioning to you earlier enclitics. These are words that go closely with the preceding word and give rise to a special class of rules of accent. Eimi is one good example of that, and various forms of the personal pronoun as well. So we'll be seeing various ways in which eimi is used as we go through the following comments. So one other little note here in passing, you notice the word ego and eimi. The word eimi means I am. If you were to have the word ego used with it, ego eimi, then it is emphatic, I am, and there's a considerable emphasis on the notion of I am. You may know, if you've done any New Testament studies, that that is the formula that's used especially in the Gospel of John, in which Jesus will make his famous I am statements. I am the door, I am the good shepherd, and it's always an ego eimi formulation, which has led New Testament scholars to understand that this is actually a way of kind of referring back to the Old Testament reference to God, Yahweh, whose name, as you know from early in Exodus, means essentially I am. And the Septuagint version of the Old Testament would translate that by the ego eimi formula. And so when in the New Testament we find that Jesus uses that ego eimi formula, then we can surmise from that that he is in fact referring back to that ego eimi idea as well. The most dramatic example of this is when we find in John chapter 8, toward the end of that chapter, Jesus says, before Abraham was, ego eimi, I am. But we find in various other places that kind of usage as well. All right, let's take a look at these rules that govern enclitics. That's the first thing that Machen treats in his chapter, and so it'll probably be useful for us to do the same thing. We haven't actually looked at these personal pronouns yet, but I'm just going to indicate to you that mu here is in fact the genitive case of the pronoun which refers to ego. So it's ego, I, and then the formula that would be of me or mine would be this mu. Now in Greek, the word mu is always placed right after the word of which the possession is attached. So in this case, it's going to be adelphos mu, which would be rendered a brother of me. In translating that, we would say my brother, a brother of me. The important thing to notice here, however, is that mu is enclitic. It does not have an accent of its own. That's really the definition of an enclitic word. It's a word that does not have its own accent. Because it goes so closely with the preceding word, you can, in some sense, virtually think of mu as part of the preceding word. And this gives rise to the first rule for enclitics, and that is that when you have a word that's accented on the ultima, followed by an enclitic, that accent that would normally have become a grave remains acute. And so it's adelphos mu, you see, adelphos mu. The two words are taken together so closely that the acute accent is not going to become a grave. So that's the first of the rules. The second one is somewhat similar. Here you see again we have the word mu, only what we notice is that in this case it's not adelphos with the accent on the ultima, but it's anthropos with the accent here on the antepenult. And so this rule says that when you have an accent on the antepenult, an acute accent, it couldn't be a circumflex of course, you have an acute accent on the antepenult followed by an enclitic, then we need to add an accent. We're just going to throw in an extra accent here on the ultima, so it's anthropos mu. And so that extra accent is making it easier to say, to pronounce the words together. So anthropos mu is the rule that would apply in this case. A similar rule is going to be encountered when you have a circumflex on the penult. You know that a circumflex can reside on the penult when there's a long accented penult. And again, if it's followed by enclitic here, then we're going to throw in an extra acute on the ultima, so it's doron mu, you see, with the emphasis there. So that's the first thing to notice about how these enclitics work. I think you can see it's not all that tough, but you do have to keep your eye on it as you're going along. We have a similar kind of situation here, anthropos estin. Estin is a two-syllable enclitic, but again, in this situation, there's no difference in the way that we apply the rule. So it's anthropos, with the accent on the ultima, estin, and similarly here, doron estin. So even if it's a two-syllable enclitic, we're going to have the same rule in this case. This again is a situation where you have an acute accent on the antepenult or a circumflex on the penult. In either case, we're going to add an acute on the ultima when it's followed by an enclitic, regardless of whether the enclitic is one syllable or two syllables. All right, now we move to a slightly different situation. This is the word ace, and you recall ace is a preposition. It means into. It ordinarily takes the accusative, such as we find here. This is the word me, which is translated me, and indeed we get our word me in English from me in Greek, so that should make that fairly easy to remember. This is the accusative, singular, from the word ego, so to me. This is into me. Now you notice that ace is ordinarily proclitic, meaning that it doesn't have its own accent, but the next rule of enclitic accent is when you have a proclitic followed by an enclitic, the proclitic will add an acute accent, just as we saw in the case of the other words we were looking at. So again, just to make it easier to pronounce, in the original Greek language, the accent would be added here, an acute accent now, followed by an enclitic. Similar situation arrives here. Remember we had anthropos mu, and that required the addition of the acute accent on the ultima. But let's say that we have an enclitic following another enclitic. Well, in that case, just as we saw above, we're going to put in an additional acute accent after on the first enclitic to again facilitate pronunciation with respect to the second enclitic. Anthropos muestin would be the way that would be pronounced. And so again, you can see it follows generally the principle that we've already looked at. It's just some other applications of it. Next situation is just a little bit different. Here we have hora estin. Hora estin. This now is a two-syllable enclitic following a word that has an acute on the penult. And in this situation, with a two-syllable enclitic only, we're going to throw in an additional accent on the enclitic word. So estin, which means it is, or he is, or in this case, an hour is, requires the addition of that accent on the enclitic word only when you have, you see, an acute on the penult. Just a little word to the wise, the same rule does not apply if you have a circumflex on the ultima. In that case, this two-syllable enclitic will remain enclitic, that is not accented. But in the particular case where you have an acute on the penult followed by a two-syllable enclitic, then we're going to give that enclitic its own accent there, and again, that's just to facilitate pronunciation. All right, now I'd like to turn your attention to these personal pronouns. We've covered the rules of enclitic accent, and of course when we get to the exercises we'll see how those are applied, but these personal pronouns are really quite important, and I thought I'd take the time to just look at them individually with you at this point. So here we have the word ego. We already looked at that in the vocabulary list. Ego, accented on the ultima. This is never enclitic. The only enclitic words in this list are these three. And you can tell in the vocabulary they have an enclitic form when Machen puts in parens after the word the enclitic version of the word. So, if you're going to emphasize the word, emu, then this is the form you'll use, and it in fact has its accent. But in the ordinary course of events, you don't need to emphasize the word. It's not like my ball, it's just my ball, you know. And so if you're using a non-emphatic form, then we have the enclitic. It's only these, you see, that have an enclitic form. All of these are non-enclitic. They always have their own accent. So on this list, there's only three one-syllable pronouns that are enclitic. We'll notice that as we go along. Over here we have heimes, this means we. Heimon, this is of us, showing possession, the genitive plural. Heimen, notice the circumflex on the iota. The iota here is long. This is to us. And then heimas, again, notice the circumflex. All the way through, of course, all of these have a circumflex. And that is us in the sense of the direct object, throw the ball to us. So that's the personal pronoun, the first person pronoun in its various forms. Notice there's no masculine or feminine here because, of course, when the first person is being used, then that's going to hopefully be obvious just by the person that's using it. So we don't have a distinction at this point between masculine and feminine. Now let's take a look at the second person pronoun. This is the word you, and once again we find a similar set of forms that are really quite similar to what we saw. Su here is in fact never enclitic. So you'll notice that su is always going to have an accent. However, again, just as we saw before, there are three enclitic forms, su, soy, and se. And so when you're using those, you'll find that they can be and usually are enclitic. If they are emphatic, then the accent is included, but there's no different spelling. It's not the same as with the first person pronoun where you actually spelled it differently. So the spelling remains the same. The only difference is if it's not emphatic, then we're going to delete or not use the emphasis, and we're not going to use the accent, and thus the accent is going to give rise to the enclitic form. Over here, very similar to the words we already saw, we have humes, humon, humin, humas. Same spelling, except you've got the who at the beginning instead of the hey at the beginning. So if you have the hey, you know it's going to be some form of first person plural, we. If it's the who, then it's referring to a second person plural, you. And that's how I've always remembered this since I first took Greek 100 years ago, was the who is you. And so that's how that hopefully can stay in your mind as well. Otherwise, the spellings are the same. And we'll move on then to the last of these pronouns. Of course, when we look at the last of these, we immediately notice that there's quite a few more, and that's because when we're dealing with the third person, we of course do make a distinction not only between masculine and feminine, but also between plural and singular. And so up here at the top we have the singular forms. Down here at the bottom we have the plural forms. These endings, of course, are endings you're already familiar with. These are the standard second declension endings right here. These are standard first declension endings here. These are second declension, commonly found, however, in the neuter gender. And so this is he, she, it. And then we have the genitive of all three. We have the dative and we have the accusative. And in each case, of course, we're simply distinguishing between the masculine, the feminine, and the neuter. The endings are pretty predictable. These are the endings we've already seen, so there shouldn't be any surprises there. Notice that in the genitive and dative of all three genders, the accent is on the ultima. The retentive rule keeps it there. And Rule 40 that we learned some chapters back also indicates that the acute becomes a circumflex in the genitive and dative, and that rule holds true throughout all three of these genders. And so again, it's not a surprise, but it is something to bear in mind. When we come down here to the plural side, We have a similar kind of arrangement in the singular and plural, of course. That same rule applies. So we find the circumflex in the genitive and dative of all three genders. And this, of course, is the plural. And they feminine here, and they in the sense of neuter. So referring to neuter objects. But again, the endings are pretty much what we've seen already. No surprises here. We have the alpha indicating the first declension, and in the neuter we of course have the endings that we've already noted with other neuter words in the plural. So only thing to bear in mind is that the accent is on the ultima, and that this is quite a common word in the New Testament, used in other forms or other purposes than what we're studying right now, but at least learn the forms at this point, and that will help you. You'll notice that Machen's concluding paragraph here makes an important point. He says the declension of autos here is like that of agathos, which you've already learned. Of course, we don't have the vocative in this case, except that the form of auto, as he indicates right here, is found in the nominative and accusative singular neuter, as opposed to autos. There's no sigma at the end of it, which we would have had with agathos. Otherwise, if you've learned the declension of agathos, then you're in good shape for learning autos, because it is, with that one exception, identical. Down at paragraph 97, Machen continues with a general discussion of pronouns. If you've studied some English grammar or studied other languages, then this should be pretty familiar territory for you, but I'll just go through it briefly here. He gives as an example the sentence, "I see the disciple and teach him." And of course, in this sentence, the word him is a pronoun, and it is intended to go back with what's called its antecedent, which is the word disciple. It means the same thing as I see the disciple and teach the disciple, but of course that's somewhat awkward to say it that way, and so we use the word him to stand there, and it makes it much more listenable or readable. The noun for which the pronoun is standing there is called the antecedent, as we indicated. Thus, the sentence, "I see the disciple and teach him," the antecedent, of course, of him is disciple. Now, in Greek, the pronoun must agree with its antecedent in gender and number, not necessarily in case. You may use the pronoun in a different case in the sentence. For example, I might say, "I see Bob, and I toss the ball to him." Well, Bob would be in the accusative case there, "I see Bob," but if I said I toss the ball to him, that would be in the dative case. So you can tell the case may vary in a given sentence, but the agreement in gender and number must be kept in mind as you're working through the exercises. The discussion continues over on page 48, where Machen gives some examples. So let's look at the first one. We have the simple sentence here, "Blepo, I see, ton methetain, the disciple, kai, didasko, I teach, auton, him." And you can tell that auton there is going to be a pronoun, and notice that it must agree with disciple, which is the antecedent of that pronoun, and it agrees in gender, it's masculine, and in number, it's singular. So we have an example of this, very typical example. Take a look at number B here, a letter B. "Meno, I remain, in to oiko, in the house, kai, and gnosko, auton, and know it." Now, auton, of course, is masculine, because again, it's agreeing with oiko, house, which is masculine. But when we translate into English, obviously we're not going to refer to the house as him, even though it's masculine in Greek, and so we need to do a little bit of maneuvering there, and we're going to translate it, I know it here, you see, as a neuter pronoun, because that obviously makes better sense in English. Dropping down to letter C, we have the example, "He ecclesia, the church, didaske, third person singular, teaches, eme, me." Here, of course, eme is emphatic, so it's teaching me, and I'm placing a bit of an emphasis on that. Kai ego, I, didasko, teach autein. And notice once again, autein is feminine, but because it's actually going with church back here, we're going to translate it as it. I suppose sometimes poetically you could refer to the church as she, and that's fine, but unless you intend to do that, you need to be conscious of it. Ordinarily, we would translate it by the word it. Here we have blepo, I see, tous, mathetos, the disciples, kai, didasko, I teach, autus, them. So here autus is going to be associated with its antecedent mathetos, and its accusative, it's masculine, and it's plural. We translate it, I teach them. Notice here, blepo, I see, ta, tekna, the children, kai, didasko, and teach, auta. Well, here, auta is neuter. But of course, the reason it's neuter is because the children back here are neuter, and so to agree in gender requires that it be neuter, and yet we obviously have personalities in mind, and so that would be the way that would be rendered. He notices here the personal pronouns are not used in the nominative case unless there is emphasis upon them. We're going to see more about that as we go along, but just make a note of it that the personal pronouns in the nominative are implied in the verb that's being used, and unless you're really wanting to put an emphasis on that particular pronoun, you won't normally use it in a Greek sentence. Machen gives further explanation of this rule over on page 49. You'll notice he says the reason for this rule is that the ending of the verb indicates sufficiently whether the subject is the first, second, or third person. So lego means I say, and we don't need to give a separate pronoun in Greek. The ego is not necessary to the sense of the sentence, so normally it's not going to be included unless there's going to be some kind of emphasis, as if to say, I say, as opposed to someone else says, you see. Emphasis usually stands for contrast. So, for example, ego lego, I say, su da graphes, but you write, you see. So we've got a contrast there. I say, but you write, and in that case, you might very well use that personal pronoun ego, and that contrast is therefore highlighted by that. At paragraph C, he notes that autos is almost never used as a personal pronoun in the nominative case. The place of it in the nominative is usually taken by certain other words, and it, in the nominative case, has a very distinct use that we're actually going to take up in the next chapter. And so I'm not going to comment more on that, but you can get ready for that in chapter 9. We're going to be seeing the further uses of the word autos, which is quite important, but we'll leave that for a little bit later. At letter 5 here, or number 5, he says to express possession, usually the unemphatic forms of the personal pronouns are going to be used. So, for example, you're going to have typically, to express the notion my word, ho logos mu. You see, mu is not emphatic. There's no accent on it. It is enclitic, and in this case it goes, therefore, with the preceding word, ho logos mu, thy word. My word, actually, and then the next one, thy word, ho logos su, again, non-emphatic, the enclitic form. His word would be ho logos autou, the word of him. Her word, ho logos autes, notice the feminine pronoun there. Its word, ho logos autou, the autou is both the masculine form and the neuter form. And then finally their word, ho logos auton, with the plural there. If it's desired to emphasize the possessive idea in the sense of my word as opposed to your word, for example, then a possessive adjective, which is going to be learned later, would ordinarily be used. Notice that he says here at number 6, after prepositions, the emphatic forms of the personal pronouns are normally used. So that is kind of an exception, but if you're going to use the personal pronoun with a preposition, ex emu would be more common, and notice that that's the emphatic form, not ek mu, which would be the non-emphatic form. Similarly here, ap emu, not apo mu. And so he also notes, by the way, that the
apostrophe there is called an elision, and he makes note of that down here. You want to notice that as you go through. We have D, again the same thing, D emu, emphatic form, not diamu, and so on. But one exception to the exception here, if you can stand it, pros me, that is the unemphatic form of the word me there is used with the preposition pros, and so you'll find that commonly in the New Testament, and also, I might add, you'll find it commonly in the exercises.
All right, the last thing I want to look at before we take a look at some exercises is this word eimi. Eimi is enclitic throughout its various forms, except for a, the second person singular, a, thou, is the way that Machen will render that, and that will follow that same convention. So I am, esten, esmen, este, and asin, all are enclitic, meaning in the ordinary course of events, this accent that you see here will not show up unless one of the rules of enclitic accent requires that it show up, and we've talked about that already. These, of course, are the verbs of being, so all forms of being, I am, you are, they are, etc., are the words that are going to be represented by this Greek word. It's quite important in the New Testament. As I said, the Greek language adds a fair amount of subtlety to its expression just because it has a well-formulated verb of being, which was not, in fact, the case of other ancient languages. And so for that, we can be appreciative of the Greek language, and also we realize that we have a responsibility to gain some mastery of this word because it plays such an important role in New Testament Greek.
The other thing to notice is that the third person plural can have the movable nu, which you've learned about back in paragraph 44. And in paragraph 99, Machen makes note of the fact that this verb of being takes the predicate nominative. That's the same as you would find in English. So if you have I am a man, the word man in that sentence would be in the nominative case, not in the accusative case, and he illustrates that principle, for example, here. Ho apostolos, the apostle, anthropos, estin, is a man. Notice it's anthropos, not anthropon.
Well, let's take a look now at this first exercise. This is the first from the exercises on page 50, if you're following the same text here, same publication that I am of Machen's text. I think it'll be the same in any of them. So here we are. Hoi mathetai su gnoskusi tein basilean kai augusi tus adelphus auton ace autain. Nice sentence. Let's look at it. Hoi, we know now, we are pretty familiar with this, is the nominative, plural, masculine of the word the definite article. It goes with this first declension noun, mathetai, so even though the hoi is second declension, mathetai is a masculine noun of the first declension, the disciples. The new piece of information we run into now is su. And you recall, su is from the second person pronoun, and it means of thee, thy or you, and it is enclitic, and so we notice that this accent, which was normally going to change to a grave, does not change to a grave because, of course, we have an enclitic word following. So literally, the disciples of you. Gnoskusi, third person plural, know, they know, the disciples of you know. Here we have an accusative, feminine noun, tain, the, basilean, kingdom, the kingdom, accusative, kai, and augusi, third person plural, they lead. Tus, this is of course accusative, plural, masculine, adelphus, and adelphus is accented on the ultima, and we're going to change that accent to a grave because it's followed by auton. And you may recall that no form of auton is enclitic. These are all, in every case, accented, and so we don't have any special rules applying. So adelphos, the accent became a grave, followed by auton. which of course is the third person plural genitive. And we don't know if it's masculine or feminine or neuter because it's the same form in all three, but we can surmise from the sentence the correct answer. And so it's the brothers of them, and then ace into, notice no accent here because again, obtain is not enclitic, and it is feminine. And of course, we know that the other feminine noun, the antecedent of that pronoun, is this word basileon. And so it's feminine because basileon is feminine. And so very literally it would read, the disciples of thee know the kingdom and lead the brothers of them, or their brothers, into it. So their brothers, referring back to the disciples. The disciples know the kingdom and lead their brothers into it. And the it here going with basileon is feminine. And I hope that's clear. I hope that makes sense to you. That should be fairly straightforward. Let's take a look at the second of the exercises. Exercise number 2, didasko tous adelphus mu kai lego autois parabolane. A little shorter. Didasko, from our very first vocabulary list, so you should know this quite well by now. Didasko, I teach, first person, singular. Accented, of course, on the penult, because when the last is long, the acute can only go back to the penult. The recessive rule wants it to go as far back as it can, but in this case it can't come back to the antepenult because we have a long ultima. So just to remind you of those basic rules of accent we covered earlier. Didasko, I teach. Tous, this is the accusative plural, and it's masculine. So I teach the adelphus brothers. This is, of course, masculine, plural, accusative. I teach the brothers, and then mu, of me. But remember again that mu is enclitic. It doesn't have an accent. And of course, the rules of accent dictate that when you have an acute on the ultima, it's not going to change to a grave when it's preceding preceding an enclitic. And so that's why we find it in this form. I teach the brothers of me, or we'd say in a little better English, I teach my brothers, kai, and lego, I say, autois, dative, plural, masculine, to them, referring back to the brothers, I say to them, parabolane, a parable. So again, that should be pretty straightforward. The only thing in this exercise that was new was the use of the word mu. Otherwise, it's pretty much what you've seen, except, of course, we have this personal pronoun here, the dative plural masculine of the word them. So that also is something to keep an eye on in this exercise. Otherwise, pretty straightforward. Let's go ahead and take a look at the third. All right, the third of the translation exercises we have before us, agema ho kurios pros tous mathetas autou. Again, pretty straightforward. Age from ago, I lead. This is third person singular. He leads. Me is from ego. It's the accusative singular. He leads me. The me here is enclitic, and thus the accent on the penult is enough to carry this word along, so we don't add an accent anywhere. We don't have an accent on the enclitic, so it's agame, agame. He leads me. Then we learn who's doing the leading. Ho, this is nominative singular masculine, kurios, the Lord. So far we have the Lord leads me. Pros, you remember when we're implying motion, typically the pros will be used, the preposition. To, which takes the accusative. Pros, tous, this is the masculine, accusative, plural, going with the masculine noun of the first declension mathetas. So the Lord leads me to the disciples, autou, of him, that is, of the Lord. Here's the personal pronoun autou. It's associated with kurios, agrees, of course, in gender and number, not in case, because of course the case may be different in some other part of the sentence. So the Lord leads me to the disciples of him, or to his disciples. All right, hope that makes sense. Let's go ahead and look at some of the composition exercises translating from English to Greek. All right, the first of our composition exercises, your servants are in the house of the Lord. To express the idea your servants in Greek, you have to turn the phrase around a little bit and actually think of it in terms of the servants of you. Your servants, the Greek would say, the servants of you. Always, or virtually always, using the definite article, so it's the masculine, plural, nominative, hoi, douloi, the servants, douloi. We have the, of course, circumflex on the penult. A long accented penult must have the circumflex, so hoi, douloi. And then we have humon. Remember, humon is not enclitic. It has its own accent, and so there's no additional accenting that we need to worry about. And it simply is the slaves of you, genitive, plural, the slaves of you, humon. But then notice here we have asin, are, third person plural from eimi, they are. This is enclitic. And you recall in the rules of enclitic accent, the circumflex on the ultima does not give rise to the need for an additional accent on the enclitic. If there had been an accent here, if the penult had had an acute accent, then indeed we would have had to accent asin. You recall that rule, but in this case it's a circumflex on the ultima, and so no additional accent is necessary for asin. So the slaves of you are, they are, en. The vowel here means we're going to include the movable nu, asin, en. In takes the dative, so to, dative singular, oiko, the house, to, of, kuriou, the Lord. The accent moves to the penult from the antepenult because, of course, the last is long. The only thing tricky in this, really the only thing new, is the use of this personal pronoun and the accent of the enclitic word here, or I should say the non-accent of it because it is enclitic. Otherwise, pretty straightforward. The slaves of you, your slaves, are in the house of the Lord. Second sentence in the composition, my house is in the desert. My house is in the desert gives us some new opportunities to explore the rules of accent. Ho, of course, the. Oikos is normally accented with a circumflex on the penult. Here we find it's followed by mu. Mu would normally be enclitic. And you recall when you have a circumflex on the penult followed by an enclitic, then you add an acute on the ultima. So it's going to be oikos mu. But then we also have this additional situation of an enclitic following an enclitic. This is a two-syllable enclitic following, of course, the word mu. And the additional rule states that when an enclitic follows an enclitic, then you're going to put an acute accent on the ultima of the first enclitic. So that's why you get this rather strange appearing set of accents here. Hoi oikos mu esten. The house of me is. En starts with a vowel, and so we're going to include the movable nu. The house of me is. En takes the dative. The word eremo is a feminine noun of the second declension, so in, te, feminine article, eremo, dative case, second declension noun, in the desert. Trickiest part of this is this set of accents right here, so I hope you were able to follow that explanation. That's the way those accent rules would apply in this situation. All right, the last of the composition exercises that we're going to be going through at this point is this one, number 3, which reads, the prophet knows his disciples and brings them into his houses. So the prophet knows, again we have this is the masculine article, prophetes, even though it is first declension, is masculine. So ho prophetes, accent on the penult as we find it in the vocabulary list. The prophet, genoske, knows. This is third person singular. He knows. Takes the accusative. Tous, mathetas, again masculine noun, but it happens to be a masculine noun of the first declension. Tous mathetas, the disciples, autou, of him. This, of course, is the third person pronoun, so the prophet knows the disciples of him, or his disciples, kai, and phare, leads, ferries them, leads, autus. This is accusative, plural, masculine, leads them, referring back to the disciples, leads them, autus. Ace, remember that even though ace is proclitic words do not give rise to special rules of accent. So we do have the grave here, even though it's in front of a proclitic word, different from what would be the situation with an enclitic. So pretty straightforward once again. The prophet knows his disciples and brings them into his houses. Well, I hope that explanation has been helpful to you. As again, I say this particular chapter is a little bit more complicated because of the variety of new information that's provided to you. It's a very limited vocabulary list, but to master these rules of enclitic accent, to get a feel for the personal pronouns, as well as the use of the verb of being, eimi, all of these are quite important. So let me just give you a little pep talk here at the end that this chapter 8 is very much worth your careful attention. It can be a little tricky at points, but if you'll work through the exercises and be very careful to make sure as you go along that you're able to detect why each exercise is done just the way it is, then again, this will serve you well as you continue your studies of the Greek language. So my best wishes to you as you continue. Congratulations on making it this far, and I hope that you'll find a great deal of joy and satisfaction as you gradually master this material, this information, and soon enough you'll find that you can actually flip open your Greek New Testament and begin at least making a little bit of sense out of what's going on in the text there. We'll do some of that ourselves before we're done, but right now we'll just keep plodding through these chapters as we go. So I'm looking forward to seeing you next time. Hope everything's going well with you, and until then, may God richly bless you.